All right, I think now we're ready to get started with the main presentation. My name's Alex Brown. I'm with Real Life Projects. I'm helping to sponsor and serving as a volunteer for this event. But our main speaker today is going to be Bill Duncan. Bill is a giant in the world of project management. And he's not only a giant, he's a modest giant. I had to talk him into even putting a photo of himself up here. He said, well, you know, the results speak for themselves. And I think Bill is the kind of guy who has created so many results over the years, everything from participating in the original PMBOK guide of PMI, a lot of the gaps and other certification methodologies that have come up from IPMA. He's added so much to the community, and I know I personally, if I ever have a problem or a question and I'm not sure what the best answer is to it, I want a challenging person to talk to about it. Bill, you're the person who I call in those situations. So, Bill, let me turn the platform over to you, and we can get started with your presentation.
Okay, sounds good. We've got the title slide for today's presentation. I guess before I get started on that, I should just say, repeat, Alex's welcome to everyone. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. I guess if you're in Europe, it's good evening, and if you're in Australia, you should be in bed asleep by now. Our presentation for today we've entitled The Wizard of Odds. Nice little pun. I hope you all appreciate it. The subtitle we have here says Improving Your Chances of Finding a Competent Project Manager. I'd like to clarify, I hope it was clear from the announcement, we're not talking here about searching the marketplace and under which rocks you might find competent project managers, but more that improving your chances of determining if the project managers that you have within your organization or the project managers that you are thinking of hiring are in fact competent. So that said, let's start with just a gentle reminder here. The presentation is in fact copyrighted. Portions of it belong to various different people. It will be posted on the ASAPEM website. Those of you who are listening in here are more than welcome to download, take a look at it. If you do want to share it with anyone else, you should get permission or at least make certain to include the copyright notice in what you hand out. A little quote to start off. I picked this up from Diane Dromgold recently. For project matters, it matters who manages it. Nice little quote to remind us of why we're interested. Projects at the very simplest level, I think, may be life skills, where almost anyone can do it. I did actually teach project management once to my oldest son's third grade class, and to be quite honest, they did better on some of the exercises than some of my adults, or some of the adults in my classes. So I think at the simplest level, projects are in fact simple. Project management is easy to understand. As projects get more complex, requires a greater understanding of project management and a greater emphasis on competence. This next slide is kind of a summary of what I'll be talking about today. If you want to improve your odds of finding a competent project manager, 4 main points. You should be focused on performance, not knowledge. I will be talking more about that, of course, as we go. You should use a structured approach, just a random approach to looking at project managers and project management generally won't do. Something that's anecdotal rather than structured is probably not going to be terribly effective, and you also want people who understand both assessment and evaluation to be doing those assessments. Third point, you want to actually get evidence. There are many of us who can talk a good game, who can say all the right things in response to questions, but who aren't actually able to deliver on the job. And the final point is we like to say that project management is a talent or a skill that is independent of the project being managed. That's true to an extent. It is often useful to have some level of technical knowledge of the product or the project that you're working on, but typically that's not fundamental to success as a project manager. On the other hand, someone who can manage a simple project may not be able to be equally successful at a more complex, more difficult project. And once again, we'll get into that in a moment as well. Tying those 4 points into our agenda for the day, I want to start by talking a little bit about competence, both what it is and what it isn't. Competence, competency, and competencies are terms that are often used interchangeably and with something less than precision. Second point, we need to be able to assess competence, and that really has two major dimensions. Are your project managers doing the right things, and are they doing them right? And then the final point is matching the competence of those project managers to the complexities of your projects. Very often a project manager who is successful with a smaller, simpler project demonstrates that they are not, in fact, capable of handling larger and more complex projects. All right, I've got a couple of subtitle slides in here. This is the first one. The quotes are mostly there for your entertainment, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over the details. But as we talk about competence, I think the quote from Butler here is potentially relevant. Now, here's a definition of competence provided by the Australians. Australians have done quite a bit of work in the area of competence on the job competence. And this comes from some of the first work that they did focusing on professionals. The original developments in Australia were focused on trades and crafts, relatively simple disciplines, if you will. And as they started getting into looking at how do we assess the performance of physicians, veterinarians, architects, project managers, and so on, this was the definition that they came up with. So basically what it says, can you do what's expected? If you are a competent project manager, that would suggest that if I went to your boss and said, is this person competent? Your boss would say, yes. So with that in mind, I've got a slightly modified version of a model that Lynn Crawford from Bond University on the Gold Coast in Australia has developed. And there's nothing terribly remarkable here. We're looking at inputs, we're looking at outputs, inputs being converted into outputs by the work that the project manager does on the job. Now, when we talk about inputs, we often refer to those as either attitudes, skills, or knowledge. So as you start to see the model developing here, the attitude of the individual involved, the skills that they have, the knowledge that they are able to bring to play affects their ability to do the work on the job. That, in turn, affects their ability to generate the outputs that are desired. So when we're looking at outputs, I'm going to refer to those as performance or results on the job. And as well, we would expect to see some level of feedback from the actual performance that's being produced by the project manager into how they're conducting their work, and their performance may also modify their attitudes, or it may show a need to develop additional skills and knowledge. Continue with some work from Lynn Crawford. This is from an article that was published in the International Journal of Project Management several years ago. Basically, the research that was done looked at project managers' performance. And they said, who scores well on tests? Who does the things that they're supposed to do? And is there, in fact, a correlation between that knowledge and practice and how their managers perceive their ability? And the result of the research said that there was, in fact, no direct relationship. So people who can pass a written test, people who know that they're supposed to be using Microsoft Project or Primavera's Pre-3 or following the corporate methodology, the people who do these things are not necessarily the ones that are perceived as being highly skilled by their managers. So some conclusions there. The first is that knowledge, in fact, does not equal competence. If you look at our definition of competence as the ability to perform, simply having the knowledge doesn't do it for us. And the second piece is we also need to remember that experience does not guarantee competence for us. We will often find that people assume that someone with 3 years, 4 years, 6 years of experience is competent to do the job, and in fact there's no guarantee of that. The line that some of you may have heard that I've got 20 years of experience, or do you have 1 year of experience 20 times? So if knowledge doesn't make it and experience doesn't make it, those are inputs. What do we want to take a look at? And fundamentally, I believe, ASAPM believes, that outputs are a far more dependable approach to looking at competence. Specifically, we use what's called performance-based competency assessment. The original version of performance-based assessment was actually developed by the U.S. Army, has been around for about 30 years. The Army has come in and out of using it consistently. If you Google performance-based competency, you'll actually find a half a dozen or so articles from various individuals in the Army over the past 3 or 4 years talking about some of the things that they've been doing in terms of trying to make sure that the U.S. fighting force in particular has the skills that are necessary to do their jobs. In addition, most human resource professionals are, in fact, familiar with performance-based competency. It hasn't taken hold in project management perhaps the way it should have, but if you talk to your HR folks, they will understand what it's all about. Finally, it is used by Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Mexico, UK, the European Economic Community, Common Market, has a major initiative underway to convert many of their job standards to performance-based competency in such a way that if you want to hold a job in the European community, probably 3-4 years is probably a little bit quick, but let's say in 8 to 10 years, you will be being assessed against performance-based competency if you want to have a job and be able to transfer your skills and your positions around in that environment. So, focusing on outputs and performance-based competency, our first question is, what should your project managers do? In order to answer this question, we asked a whole bunch of people what they thought. In doing this, we were working with an organization called GAPS, Global Alliance for Project Performance Standards. ASAPM is a charter member in GAPS, one of the founders of the organization. And I've listed here some of the things that GAPS did to identify what is expected for basic competence for a project manager. We did what's called the job analysis, which is looking at what individuals who currently hold that position actually do. It was often quite an extensive literature review of everything from PMI's PMAC guide to the material that IPMA produces called the ICB, IPMA Competence Baseline. Also looking at various other studies and analysis of both project management and related project work. Also lots of input from individuals in both academia, consultants and trainers, managers of project managers, and actually talking to project managers as well in terms of what do they do, what's expected of them. In sifting that information, collecting and sifting that information, we organize the answers into a structured model. What I've got on this next slide just is a conceptual illustration of the competency standards that we use to do assessments within ASAPM. At the upper level, you've got what we call units of competence, and you'll see there I've just highlighted one of them. The second unit says to develop a plan for the project, or to develop the project plan. That has several elements. This slide includes 2 of them. One of the first elements is to actually define the work. The second element is to agree on what we mean by success. I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where the project manager thinks they've done a great job, and then they sit down with their sponsor or their boss at some point after the project is over and discover that there were other stakeholders who were deeply dissatisfied. So one aspect of competence is to make sure that you've got agreement on what success means as part of planning the project, so that you're not surprised at the end of the project. The third level, again, in terms of organizing the research that was done around what does a competent project manager do, third level is called performance criteria. And again, I've just extracted and kind of summarized 3 here. So part of defining the work is to make sure you've got agreement on the outcomes. What are the benefits that the stakeholders are expecting, so that we know we've got our eyes on the right target. The second performance criteria that's listed there is the work items. What are the things that we actually have to do in order to be able to deliver a result that will produce the desired outcomes? And the third item that I've listed there is assumptions. We actually look for a project manager who has identified and documented assumptions, constraints, and exclusions. These guide the planning as well as guiding the work of the project. And this was one of the key things that many people told us was important to them in terms of assessing the competence of their project managers. So this gives you the basic structure. Now, let me give you a little more detail on the whole model. The next slide shows the 5 units. Remember the units of competence being the top level. And you'll see number 2 here is managing development of the project plan. That was one that I was showing on the previous slide. First item, managing stakeholder relationships. One little sort of fun story that I do like to tell around this one. One of the early drafts had managed stakeholders. And one of our reviewers said stakeholders are clearly unmanageable. So we changed the title from manage stakeholders to manage relationships, feeling that more accurately described what was expected. So we're dealing with the stakeholders. Number 2 is developing a plan. Number 3 is managing progress, making sure that we're delivering against the plan as well as adjusting the plan as needed in response to internal, external events, as well as internal progress. 4 is managing project transitions, going from phase to phase of the life cycle. So if on an IT project, for example, going from requirements to design, design to development. If I am managing a construction project, perhaps going from front-end engineering into EPC, engineering, procurement, construction. And the 5th piece is managing product acceptance, making sure that your customer or client does in fact accept the product of the project, does in fact agree that what you have produced for them is what they were expecting. So these are the 5 units. These are the 5 things that we expect project managers should be able to do. All right, now a little detail. These are the elements from Unit 1. If you remember back from 2 slides ago, elements are the 2nd level. So in terms of managing stakeholder relationships, we've identified 4 key components or elements of that. First, making sure that the stakeholder interests are in fact identified and addressed. Do we know what the stakeholders are looking for? Second, promoting both individual and team performance. Project management isn't just about getting the best out of the team. It's also thinking of your team members as individuals. Third point, managing stakeholder communications, making sure that people have the information that they want, the information that they need in the appropriate time frame, in the appropriate form. And the 4th point, managing external stakeholder participation. For the most part, there are external stakeholders, people outside the immediate project team. Many project managers don't like to make a distinction between internal and external stakeholders, but we did feel that it was important to recognize that there are some people who are more actively involved in the project than others, and that part of the role or the responsibility of the project manager is to make sure that those external parties are in fact actively involved in the project. So that you're getting the information that you need from them and so that there won't be any surprises from them at the end. Now, if you look at the first element here, ensure that stakeholders' interests are identified and addressed. On this next slide, I've included the performance criteria for just that one element. So in this case, the 3rd level of performance criteria has 4 particular items. First one says that the pertinent stakeholders are determined. A couple of things about the phrasing here. Performance criteria are always stated in the passive mode. These are things that the assessor is expected to observe and determine whether it's actually been done. So here we're not describing so much what the project manager is doing as what the person who is assessing project manager's performance would be looking at. So pertinent stakeholders are determined. If I'm assessing you, can you show me some evidence that you did actually figure out who your stakeholders were? Did you do something to determine who they were, who was important, how you were going to deal with them? I also like the word pertinent. Kind of suggests that some stakeholders are pertinent and others are impertinent. Apologize for the little joke there. But what we're also looking at here is the idea of pertinence on the stakeholders. One of the key responsibilities of the project manager is really to understand which stakeholders are important in which circumstances and which ones are not. So moving down the list, we know who the stakeholders are. We take a look at what their interests are. We get them documented. Important to have these things written down for reference. Stakeholder interests should also be considered. Looking to say, don't just fill out this form. Don't just have a piece of paper that says this is what my stakeholders want, but that you should, as a competent project manager, be constantly and regularly referring to that information to make sure that those interests are driving your considerations on the project. And now the fourth one, actions to address differing interests are implemented. Basically what we're saying here is that you may not be able to make everybody happy, but you just need to recognize and you need to deal with that. So if you have a particular stakeholder whose interests are not going to be met, take a simple example that some of you are probably familiar with. You have a team member who isn't especially interested in working overtime. Perfectly reasonable. Many of us would prefer to work from 9 to 5. Sometimes on a project, either due to poor planning or external changes in requirements or demands on the team, people are in fact required to work overtime. Part of the project manager's responsibility in that case is to make sure that the individual understands that the decision was made in consideration of their interests, that they're not ignoring the fact that that individual is not interested in working overtime, and so on. On this next slide, I've listed a couple of additional performance criteria. There are about 70 in total that we assess against, just to give you some feeling for the comprehensiveness of the performance criteria. So if you look at the first one, project success criteria are identified. I mentioned that earlier in presenting the high-level overview. If you are to be a competent project manager, you really do need to know what the performance criteria are, and do that in consultation with your stakeholders. Second point may sound simple. Characteristics of the product of the project are agreed to, but I'm sure many of you know that that is often the cause of considerable pain in many projects. If the characteristics haven't actually been agreed to, if we haven't reviewed with the stakeholders what it is we're planning on producing, they may be surprised, they may be disappointed. Certainly the project will be less successful than if we made sure that we had agreement on what we would actually be producing. The third bullet here, communication, method, content, and timing is agreed to. So we've had these discussions with our stakeholders. They know what reports they're going to be getting. They know what will be expected to review technical outputs of the project, and so on. And then the final sample on this slide, completed work items are reviewed. As each item in the project, be it an internal deliverable or external deliverable, is completed, we expect someone within the project to be looking at that to make sure that the completion criteria have in fact been met, so that we don't have surprises at the end of the project because things have not been done properly, or not been done fully. All right, now moving into the next question, which says, are they doing them right? We've looked at what a project manager does. I've just given you a high-level overview of those activities. So if I'm looking at these things saying, are you doing all these things, and then are you doing them right? Something that people often suggest is, why look at performance? Why not just look at the project's results? What I've tried to do on this next slide is kind of summarize why the project results are not necessarily evidence of competence. One of my favorite stories here in the first bullet, the project manager I worked with a number of years ago, who was asked to take over a major defense project. He turned an $80 million loss for his employer into a $20 million loss by modifying the quantity of things that were supposed to be produced by negotiating some changes to the terms of the contract with the government client that they were working with. And went from $80 million loss again to a $20 million loss. But if you look at it, the project was still late and over budget. So from an objective standard, if you look, for example, at things like the chaos report from the Standish Group, this project would be viewed as a failure. From the perspective of his managers, this project was a wild success. Yes, they lost $20 million on the project, but it was a whole lot better than having lost $80 million, which was the expectation under its predecessor. On the other hand, I expect many of you have experienced this as well. A project manager who is less than competent may in fact be able to deliver something. One of the individuals that I assessed did in fact complete a successful project, but in going over the details, there was very little evidence that this individual was in fact truly competent, but a lot of evidence that the CEO had delivered the resources that were necessary so that the project manager's lack of competence really didn't show. So the project was in fact completed successfully, but not due to much in the way of a contribution from the project manager. So what do we want to look at? I would argue there's two things. Go back. Did they actually do what they were supposed to do? And then also verify that they knew what they were doing and why. So we want to look at both things. Not just did they do all of these things, but did they understand them? If I prepare a list of stakeholders, for example, that provides some form of evidence, but if I'm competent, I understand why I performed it or why I prepared that list. I understand why individual stakeholders are on that list and why others are not. So in terms of assessing competence, the next thing we want to do is take a look at some evidence. Two major forms of evidence. First, documentary evidence. Basically, can you show me an electronic file? Can you show me a piece of paper that provides evidence, just like in a criminal case, if you will, that you actually did what you were supposed to? Second thing we look for is testimonial evidence. Did they actually understand what they were doing? Going back to the list of stakeholders. Who prepared it? Did the project manager prepare it personally? Was it prepared in consultation with the project team? Do the stakeholders that were involved know why they were included, know what their status is, and so on? So verification that they did in fact understand what they were doing. One of the nice things that I like about performance-based competencies is that it's not dependent on any particular approach to project management. So I can go in and I can use these standards to evaluate the performance of a project manager in IT who's doing agile software development. I can use the same standards to evaluate the performance of a construction project manager. I can use the same standards to evaluate the performance of a project manager who's involved in new drug development. So what we're looking for is, can you satisfy the performance criteria, not just a tick list. This isn't about compliance. It's about competence. All right. Moving on to the question of complexity. Most people will readily acknowledge the words in this next quote, that some projects are inherently harder to manage than others. I'm sure many of you have seen this. I kind of expect it that many of you have experienced this as well. You may have managed a project very successfully, been given a responsibility for another project that was significantly more difficult than the first one, and you kind of wonder why you're struggling. You're doing essentially the same things, but in a more difficult environment. So the fact that you were in fact able to manage a smaller project, simpler project, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to manage a more complex project. So the question becomes, how do you evaluate the complexity? Now, the first thing I want to note here is that if you look at this next slide, I've arranged 3 sample projects to illustrate increase in complexity. The first level we call transitional. This is transitioning from a technical role to a project management role. example project is developing an employee orientation program for a municipality. Now, this is the kind of thing that somebody in the training department might do. Might even be someone who is contracted. An organization could be contracted. But in this kind of relatively simple, relatively straightforward project, the project manager may be an individual contributor as much as a project manager. So someone who demonstrates their ability to deliver a transitional project successfully would not necessarily be able to handle a more complex project. Traditional project managers as well tend to be part-timers. Project manager here tends to be a role. It's something that I do as part of my job, but it isn't my full-time job. As we move into the next two levels, project manager and senior project manager, we see increasing levels of complexity. Running phase 2 clinical trials has a degree of complexity. I may have several researchers spread out across the country or across the world looking for running studies for me to determine the efficacy of the drug that's under consideration. I need to have some understanding of the mechanics of the process. I need to have some interpersonal skills to work with a wide variety of different people in order to deliver this project successfully. The third project, senior project manager level, if I'm doing ERP, enterprise resource planning, and it's spread out over several business units in several countries, there is clearly not only technical complexity but managerial complexity involved in that project. I need to speak with people in different countries. We may all converse in English as the typical language of business, but people who are fluent in English may still not understand particular terms or concepts. They most likely will not understand your jokes or your humor. They may not understand large numbers of cultural references. So dealing with cultural diversity in a project of that sort increases the difficulties of the project manager's job. Now, how are we going to determine which one of these categories a project fits into? We've developed a tool that looks at 6 major groups of complexity factors. I've listed them here on the next slide. The governance complexity. How many different groups and organizations are you dealing with? Is your reporting a simple matter of showing budget versus actual on your project, or are there more complex and more difficult things that need to be rendered? What's the complexity of the stakeholders that you're dealing with? Is everybody in the same organization such that we speak the same language, share a common corporate culture, or am I dealing with a wide variety of individuals and groups who may in fact not have much in common with me, who may have a very different attitude towards the project than I have? The third point, how difficult is it to define the scope of the project? By scope, we mean the characteristics of the product of the project. Is there a need for technical innovation? Are we doing something that truly hasn't been done before technically, or is it just implementation of something that we do in fact understand quite well? Related to that is the fourth item, product realization. How difficult is it for you to actually develop it? Do you have the tools available to make this happen? The fifth one, project execution, has to do with a variety of things. Are there multiple streams of work involved in the project, for example, or you just have one main output? And then the last item, the resourcing complexity. How likely are you to get the funding, whether it's external funding or simply an internal budget allocation? Is that guaranteed, or is there still uncertainty? Another example is, are there high degrees of variation in the staffing levels? On some projects, you staff up, you've got a few people on the project, and you pretty much have the same number of people on the project from the start to the end. On other projects, you have individuals constantly coming and going. One of the things I personally teach in project management, for example, is that each time you have a new team member, you have a new team. And some of the things that you need to do to bring the new individuals on board, get them up to speed, get them integrated with a team for performance. If people are constantly coming and going, then that increases the resourcing complexity. On this next slide, I've listed a couple of the detail factors. For example, if you look at the first one, how much authority does the project manager actually have? Many people like to quote the saying to me that if you expect me to be responsible, you have to give me the authority. Anybody who's been involved in project management for any level, any length of time, knows that you will in fact be held responsible, but you typically will not be given the authority. So the more work that you have to get done in the absence of authority, the more difficult that project is to manage. The second item, cultural diversity, I talked about a couple of issues related to language. One of my favorites is dealing with Canadians. In Canadian English, to table something means to bring it forward. And those of you who are Native American English speakers know that to table something means to put it off to the side. So if you're having a conversation with a Canadian and they say, I'd like to table this, you need to understand those distinctions. And that's an example of how language differences can create complexity and difficulty in the management of the project. Geographic dispersion is another issue. And there's a couple of dimensions to this. Not only are we physically separate, but also how many time zones are we in. In some cases, it might actually be easier to deal with a project that included another project team in Buenos Aires because you'd be in the same time zone versus dealing with somebody in the same company who's in California or Hawaii when you're in the eastern U.S. The time zone difference can cause problems as well. Fourth item is there a diversity of skills that are required? Are you dealing with the same kind of people, crafts, trades, professionals? How different are the concepts, the cultures, if you will, the subgroups on the project? And then the fifth one on this slide I talked about before, variability in staffing levels can cause difficulty or increased difficulty for the project manager. Now, without going into all of the details, what we ended up doing was mapping the scores on the roles. Each of the detail items is rated from 1 to 4. And this chart shows you the scoring that we use. So any project that is 60 or less is considered to be transitional. You could certainly evaluate the competence of an individual at transitional level if you wanted. At ASAPEM, we in fact do not assess that individual. Our feeling is that the successful performance on a transitional project often cannot be repeated because it's the individual's technical skills rather than their project management skills that lead to success. But for project managers and senior project managers, we're looking at higher levels of complexity, more complexity on each of the individual factors. And these are this is the tool that we use to determine whether someone should be assessed as a competent project manager or a competent senior project manager. I take just a quick minute here to recap, repeating the quote from the beginning. For project matters, it matters who manages it. Repeating this slide as well in terms of improving your odds. Understand that you should be looking, I believe, at performance, not knowledge. There's lots of knowledge-based tests out there. There are lots of people who think they're competent because they've passed a test. Our experience is that knowledge does not necessarily equate to performance. So if you want to improve your odds of finding a competent project manager, you should be looking at performance. You should use a structured approach. At ASAPEM, we use a combination of the standards developed by GAPS and IPMA. You should also demand evidence of performance. Physical evidence is nice if you're interviewing somebody for a job as opposed to assessing an individual who works with you already. You should be looking to develop questions that verify not just that they did the things that they were supposed to do, but also that they understood why they were doing them. And then the final point is recognize that competence does have a management complexity dimension to it. I refereed an article on project manager performance many years ago where the researchers discovered that this group of project managers working for a utility had in fact become less successful over their career with the utility. And what the researchers discovered is that they had failed to accommodate the level of complexity in the project. These project managers had, in fact, been quite successful earlier in their careers because they were working with simple, straightforward projects. And as they grew with the organization, remained with the organization over the years, demonstrated continued competence. They got more and more difficult, more and more complex projects to manage. would expect with a much higher level of difficulty that you'd have a somewhat lower rate of success. They were probably more successful with those projects than someone with less skill would have been with less competence. But nonetheless, the appearance was that they were becoming less skilled. So make sure when you are evaluating project managers that you are looking at the degree of difficulty, if you will, of the projects that they're managing. Very short sales pitch here for ASAPM. To the best of our knowledge, we have the only performance-based project management assessment in the U.S. In addition, our affiliation with IPMA provides for global recognition of the certifications that we provide. Our association with GAPS, I think, provides an additional layer of validity and reliability. And there's the ASAPM website URL there at the bottom of the slide for reference, and I think it's repeated on this next slide as well. No, very last slide. Okay, Alex, I guess we're ready for questions.
Actually, one question that I've got didn't come in from the audience, but I know for me it's an important one. I went through the certification process when you guys were first setting this up. So a lot of the examples that you gave, they may seem theoretical, but they were very practical to me. I guess, what are opportunities to really learn more about this standard? Obviously, you could get the certification yourself, go through the process, and that'll educate you a lot. What are other ways that you can sort of learn more about those standards and how to do a certification?
Well, the GAP standard itself, I just put up the very last slide in the presentation. Whoops, there's a typo there. Sorry about that. My apologies. That should say Global PM Standards, not stands. GlobalPMStandards.org. There on the slide that's up on the screen now. You can download the whole standard from GAPS, or we have what we call an evidence guide, which includes the performance criteria as well as lists of possible documents and questions that we would normally ask during the assessment.
And so, yeah, and I was also curious, when you're looking at gathering evidence, there's some of the criteria are relatively simple to check. You know, were you creating a work breakdown structure, for instance?
Absolutely.
I found one of the things that was really hard to assess, though, were some of the things like, are you taking your stakeholders into account? Like, how do you find evidence for that? I know it was very challenging sometimes to say, well, okay, I developed a budget, but what was the justification for the budget? A lot of times there are elements that don't get written down, but they're sort of implicit sometimes in change. How do you assess something like that?
Okay. We're always looking for documentary evidence, since that, of course, is more reliable. Sometimes an email or a memo to file provides evidence of that. You might, for example, send an email to one of the stakeholders. Let's say your sponsor. Your sponsor says, I don't want to spend more than $1 million on this project. You put your initial plan together, and it turns out you're going to have to spend $1.2 million. You send an email to the sponsor saying, I know that we targeted $1 million budget for this, but we've identified additional requirements, additional issues that have to be addressed. Here's how we developed the estimates. We think they're reliable, et cetera, et cetera. That would, the fact that you have sent an email like that to the sponsor would provide documentary evidence that you had taken their interest into consideration. Some of the softer items, we tend to rely more on the testimonial evidence, on asking you, what you did, why did you do it, listening closely to the explanations as to how you made decisions on the project. So we're always looking for a combination of both documentary and testimonial evidence.
Yeah, and actually we've got an interesting question from Stacy. It says, why is this powerful certification process so little known in the U.S.?
Damned if I know.
Well,
okay,
there's sort of an elephant in the room with that question, perhaps. But I don't know how you'd want to address that.
Yeah, I can. The elephant in the room or the 800-pound gorilla, depending upon which analogy you want to use. I think there are an enormous number of people who believe that they have been certified as competent by virtue of their PMP. And some fields, IT, for example, organizations increasingly are asking that prospective project managers have PMPs. I think in some ways it's an easy way for the HR folks to filter resumes. Some of it also is that IPMA historically, IPMA has focused on competence since the beginning, whereas PMI made the decision to focus on knowledge. And IPMA for a long time was primarily active in Europe. So if you were to ask that same question in Europe, I think you get a completely different response. I think people in Europe would tell you that it's visible, they're aware of it, they know its importance, and that in fact competence is something, assessment of competence is something that's vital to them. In the U.S. you don't see it so much. Part of the reason in the U.S. as well, despite the fact that performance-based competencies started here with the U.S. Army, some of it I think is our culture. People here tend to be focused more on how do I identify the best performers, whereas performance-based competency is focused on what we call threshold competence, which is how do I determine that someone meets the minimum requirements. So a lot of the assessment process in the U.S. is focused on how do I determine who to promote rather than how do I determine who to hire or who I should keep in the positions that I have at present. So, and some of it as well is for the past couple of years at ASAPEM, we've been more focused on developing a high-quality, high-grade system than we have been focused on marketing it and making people aware of that. So I'm moderately hopeful that in a year or two you won't have that question anymore.
Yeah, I know one thing that I found that was interesting when I went through the certification process, I originally went through it hoping to get the B-level certification, thinking that that would be sort of a more senior certification than the PMP. When I qualified at the C level, not at the B level, which is a little bit less senior. I guess that's the straight project manager level of assessment. I actually found afterwards that I took more pride in my IPMA-C assessment than my PMP. You know, having both of them, I knew that I had to produce a lot more evidence for that C-level assessment than I did for the PMP.
We just need you to tell your story to more people, Alex.
Oh, I do it all the time. I have them both on my business card. And actually, it's interesting because what you said about Europe versus the U.S. has completely rung true for me. In the U.S., people ask me, what does IPMA-C mean? When I run into somebody from Europe, they usually are impressed, oh, how did you know about IPMA when you're a U.S. person? Did you do business in Europe? And in Asia, it seems like there's almost, it depends on the country which certification is known better.
Well, again, I think it's a question of what you're looking for. The PMP is fundamentally knowledge-based. It says that you studied, it says that you can pass a test, but it does not require evidence of performance. It does not require, or historically has not required experience as a project manager. So if I'm looking to say, has this person demonstrated their ability as a project manager, I would have to rely upon an IPMA assessment. If I want to know whether somebody's studied and memorized the terms of the PMAC guide, then PMP would provide evidence of that.
We've got another question came in from Trevor. Have you addressed the importance of the interview portion? So I guess how does the interview portion, I know I went through this, so I'm sort of familiar with it. How much do you go based on the documents that somebody brings in, and then how much do you rely on the interview portion?
Well, the interview portion is, in fact, the decision-making part of the process. We use two assessors. Traditionally, performance-based competency uses a single assessor because it's more focused on the internal view. I am, for example, potentially working for an employer, and the employer wants to know whether or not the individuals in their organization are competent. We are offering a certification that says we've assessed you, we've evaluated your performance. We use two assessors to provide a broader perspective. So the interview portion is, in fact, quite vital. The decision is based not upon the evaluation of the documentary evidence, but rather on the opinion of the assessors. So both assessors have to agree that all of the performance criteria were satisfied.
And I remember when I went through the interview, it was interesting. There were several documents that I couldn't release to the assessors because they were company confidential. And the assessors really addressed those portions of my experience in the interview. So I was allowed to give sort of redacted versions of stories. And they said, just don't give me the details. Don't give me the company confidential parts. But just we'll ask you some questions about the situation and tell us about how you dealt with the situation. So I think the interview is very important for those areas that I couldn't produce documentary evidence for one reason or another.
The other thing that we've done since then is we've got a non-disclosure. So with an organization out on the West Coast recently that produces some extremely high-tech stuff for clients around the world, we simply signed a non-disclosure. So the assessors were covered by the non-disclosure, and that allowed them to share all of the information with the assessors.
Although it's interesting, if you ever go back to a former employer of yours and try and get them to accept a non-disclosure, that gets very, very difficult.
It can, and it's certainly a challenge, but I think basically what that would mean is that if someone, for example, we had a case just recently where someone had left an employer and wanted to apply for certification using the projects from that previous employer. And basically what we said is you probably need to wait 6 months until unless that previous employer is willing to release the information. You probably need to wait 6 months until you've got evidence from your current employer. So we would use the experience from the previous employer to meet the experience requirements. But we really need to see some level of physical evidence.
Yeah, and I guess one thing that I'd emphasize to everybody who's listening is just that I think the assessors that I worked with, everybody was very understanding about those kinds of real-world constraints. So, if you feel like you don't have the documentary evidence, you can't release it, just, give Bill a call. Give somebody at ASAPM a call and talk about your problem. They'll figure out that reasonable way to accommodate it.
Yep. For the most part, we've been able to accommodate most.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a couple of other questions. Do you want to pick,
sure.
Alex, or do you want me to?
Let's jump in. There's one about a 360-degree review. I think that's probably an important thing to address because that's another sort of popular assessment method. How do you guys look at a 360-degree review as compared to or as a complement to what you do in ASAPM?
Well, we do, in fact, ask for references, and we verify the references, so it's not a complete and comprehensive 360. But we do ask for a reference from your superior, and we do ask for a reference from somebody who has worked for you on a project. So we're doing many of the same things that 360 is designed for. We may at some point actually incorporate a complete 360 into the process, but at this point we're comfortable with the combination of the interview and the references.
Right. Yeah, I guess we're getting to the top of the hour now, so I just want to sort of officially wrap up the presentation. First, thank you, Bill, for presenting all this information. I hope everybody's enjoyed learning more about these assessment criteria. And I think
it's a pleasure.
The two online resources you have up on the screen, those are great places to go if you want to learn more. And, of course, joining ASAPM or any of the International Project Management Association international branches is another great way to get involved in this. And getting assessed is a tremendous way to learn about the assessment process. I think until you've worked with a certified assessor, it's hard to understand some of this theoretically.
We've frequently had comment from people saying that it was an interesting process, that they had actually learned something in the process of going through the assessment.
Yeah, no, I feel like I'm a better interviewer because I was interviewed by your assessors. I take them as a model sometimes when I need to do an interview. Well, so let's wrap this up now as the official part, but I assume you've got some time to stay afterwards. We can probably address a couple more questions now.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the questions was, what are the similarities and differences in why governments value performance certification?
I kind of hesitate to speak too much for the governments. I think there's a couple of reasons, though. Part of the reason, I think, is because it came out of government. I mean, the basic concepts behind performance-based competency were developed by the U.S. Army, which is fundamentally a government organization. So I think in the minds of some of the governments, that gave it some credibility, sort of a reverse not invented here syndrome. I think the second reason is if you look at Lynn's article that I quoted from Lynn Crawford's article, there's a mountain of evidence that shows that attributes are not particularly useful in evaluating what's called threshold competence. And the governments were generally looking at how do I determine that someone is capable of performing this job. Some of the drivers were coming from countries like Australia, which were concerned with immigration levels. Basically, is this person who's looking to immigrate to Australia, do they have the skills, do they have the abilities to perform at this level? Part of the reason was governments during some of the economic problems in the late 80s were looking for ways to evaluate whether or not the monies that they were spending on retraining individuals for areas of the economy that were growing, that did have openings, were these training programs in fact effective? And fundamentally, all the research shows that knowledge is nice, but knowledge is a building block. It doesn't get you to where you want to go. So they're saying rather than looking at can this person pass a test, do they know how to spell WBS? Right. It says let me look at actual performance. Can they actually demonstrate their ability to do the job?
And of course, in the U.S., the government question is so complex because they're government at so many different levels in the U.S., everything from a local municipality up to the federal government and even the quasi-agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They're sort of semi-government entities in the U.S. It makes it a very complex market.
I think you have similar complexities in the structure of the government pretty much every place else you go. What you don't have is the culture that we have here of government non-involvement.
Right.
You don't, for lack of a better term, I'll call it an anti-regulatory bias. Mm-hmm. So whereas Australia can say, we're going to define competency standards for every job that exists in Australia, and people will say, cool, now the training that I'm doing will be recognized by the government, and that'll make it easier for me to sell my services, etc. In the U.S., we have a tendency to say, no, let's let the market determine things.
Right.
So I have a lot of confidence, going back to Stacy's earlier question about, why is something not well known? Part of it's not well known is because we really haven't had the time and energy to let people know about it. But if I compare your experience, which is not unique, several people have said the same thing. This is really great. This is valuable to me, and I want to make sure that people understand what it means. I expect that performance-based competency will become the dominant form of assessment. In many ways, you can even see that the 800-pound gorilla has acknowledged this. While the competencies and the process that PMI uses for its PMP certification, I don't think are particularly rigorous. If you're allowed to choose your own assessors, it just creates tremendous potential for conflict of interest. I think PMI has basically acknowledged that performance-based competency is the way to go.
Yeah. Speaking of the 800-pound gorilla, PDU credits, some people are asking questions about that. Just send us an email confirming that you did attend, and we'll process that PDU claim for you. Just include your PMI ID number and your full name and your city and country, and then you'll see that claim go through in just a few days. And we'll be sending out an email to people with that instruction. So if you aren't getting that verbally here, don't worry about it. Let's see. We had one other thing in here. Stacy invited you to say anything that you'd like about your candidacy for IPMA office. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
I got to talk to Stacy. I'm actually running for head of what IPMA calls the CVMB Certification Validation Management Board, which is responsible for ensuring that all of the IPMA member associations are producing assessments of equal grade, equal validity, equal reliability. And I am hoping that if I do get elected, one of the things we'll be able to do is implement some of the aspects of performance-based competency into the IPMA program.
I think that's all the questions that we've got now. I did notice one comment that was kind of funny. Early in the presentation, you mentioned about managing progress as opposed to status. I think that's another thing that I just note about either of these standards is that they're relatively jargon-free. In other words, when I read the PMBOK guide, sometimes it seems to be a lot about defining what is a work breakdown structure. I think these standards that you've contributed to, the GAPS and the ASAPEM standards, they use less of the jargon, and rather than say status, they talk about progress. It's a little bit more plain English.
Well, I'll just say thanks.
Yeah.
Since I wrote most of the PMBOK guide as well, I think you see a different focus. This is intended to be jargon-free because it's intended to be independent of the process.
That's one of the things I find that's useful in the PMBOK guide is it does give you a kind of a common vocabulary, so that if you're talking to construction people who talk about statusing a project, we all know what we're talking about now.
Except that very few people actually use the language in the PMBOK guide.
Yeah, that is. I mean, it's an opportunity to share a common language, but that it doesn't always come through that way. It doesn't always actualize as actual common vocabulary. Okay, I think that wraps this up then. I don't see any other questions unless you have anything else you want to add at the end here.
There's a question here from Teresa.
Okay.
I think you missed.
All right. You want to read it off?
It says, I have a PMP working as a project manager now. My goal is to grow into project management consulting and training. What type of certification should I pursue? I guess the direct answer, Teresa, if you're looking to get into consulting and training, the IPMA certifications are focused on, are you competent as a project manager? And competence in consulting and competence in training are different from competence as a project manager. Some of the skills are transferable, but if that's what you want to do, I'll focus on both of those sides. If you want to get into training, I would read. Oh, my mind's blocking. What happens when you get old? Rose, if she's still online, can probably help us out. Who's the guy with 4 levels? Kirkpatrick. Read about, pick up Kirkpatrick on evaluating training programs. author's name is Donald L. Kirkpatrick. I'll teach you a whole lot about training. Read about adult learning.
Yeah.
If you want to learn about consulting, pick up some books on consulting and figure out later how to map those in.
And actually, it's interesting, if you go and you start to look at consulting, there are professional societies around consulting, which include some project managers, but also other types of consultants.
Yes.
And then, of course, there's training associations that will help you with some of that competency as well. It's
possible that in the future IPMA will offer a project management consultant certification. But if it does, I think that's a ways away, because defining what we actually mean by project management consultant, are you consulting with the organization about how the organization deals with managing projects, or are you consulting with individual project managers about how they manage individual projects? There's just such a huge difference in the range that I'm not sure what will happen with that.
Yeah, Rose had some interesting comments. She mentioned Kirkpatrick, which is the author that you already mentioned, Dr. Ruth Clark, C-L-A-R-K. And she also mentions Alan Weiss, who she describes as cheeky but helpful. I've met Alan personally, and I think that's a very good description, Rose. He is cheeky, but he is helpful.
Cheeky is good.
Yep. All right, unless you have anything else, I think that wraps us up then.
Oh, I'm done. Great.
All right,
thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody who stayed on. Looks like we have most of the people were able to stay through till the bitter end here. So thank you all for staying on. We are going to be putting this recording together and putting it out as a podcast-type format. And again, if you have any questions about PDU claims, we'll be sending you an email follow-up. Or you can just email me directly, alex@rlprj.com. But if you don't have that written down, don't worry about it. You'll get a contact via email. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and especially thank you, Bill, for the wonderful presentation. I think it was very informative.
Thanks for hosting it, Alex. We appreciate your support.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care all. Bye.